Hello and welcome to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Brown. Shepheard-Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England, whose purpose is to uncover and promote authors with new ideas to society's oldest problems, especially economic ones. Hello and welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Duncan Pickard. Duncan received a doctorate from the University of Nottingham. His postdoctoral research was at Cornell University School of Veterinary Medicine at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, was followed by a lectureship in animal physiology and nutrition at the University of Leeds. He currently farms an 1,100-acre arable and livestock holding in Fife, Scotland, with his wife and two sons. He's the author of the book Lie of Land and also a contributor of a chapter into the book Rent Unmasked. Duncan, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
So, Duncan, I gave you a very potted introduction to your background. I just wondered if you could tell us how you got into farming and what your experiences have been that led you up to be living in Fife surrounded by all those acres.
Well, we after I came back from the United States, my wife was born and brought up on a farm in East Lancashire as well, and we always thought that we'd enjoyed being brought up on a farm, and we looked to obtain a farm as soon as I was given security of tenure of the lectureship at Leeds University. And we looked around the Leeds area, which we mapped and tried to find out where would be the most convenient place to live for me to be able to travel to the university every day. And we ended up renting a 33-acre holding near Ilkley. We had the 33 acres of land and the farmhouse and buildings. The house was about to be condemned by the local authority. So the landowner, we reached an agreement that we would pay 5 years rent, fixed rent, but we would spend all that rent money on making the place habitable. And he was happy to go along with that. That was 1974. Shortly after that, there was a recession. I remember the land price fell, the land prices fell, calves were being given away, farmers couldn't sell what they had to sell, and our neighbour, who had started farming in the late 1960s, asked me to buy 18 acres of the land, which was adjoining the 33 acres that we were renting. We bought the 18 acres using money that we'd saved during our stay in America. A few years later, this neighbour of ours was losing money on her remaining acres, and she asked us to buy another 20 acres. And so that led us into farming about 78 acres, and I still had my job at the university. In 1981 or thereabouts, when Mrs. Thatcher decided that public spending needed to be drastically cut, the university was looking around ways of saving money and offered the chance for anyone who could do so to work part-time and on a part-time salary. And I accepted that. At the same time, so I was working 3 days a week on 60% of the salary. I also was employed as a consultant for a feed manufacturing company in Northampton, and they were prepared to pay me for 2 days, 1 day a month, for the 2 days a week that I was spending in university. So that was an easy decision to make, and we expanded our farming during that time. My wife's parents were retiring from their small holding near Nelson in Lancashire, and Barbara's father wanted livestock to look after, and we supplied cows that he looked after, and we took sheep to Nelson and so on. But and during the 1980s, we built up the number of acres that we were renting, so that by about 1988 or 9, I was looking after livestock on about 5 different holdings that farmers in that area were prepared to let me have on an annual basis. And also during the late 1980s was when I'd met Fred Harrison, and he asked me to write a chapter for his book, Costing the Earth, where we estimated the rental value of all the land in Great Britain. I was asked to give an estimate of the farmland, and I did that based on official statistics from the Inland Revenue, the Ministry of Agriculture, as it was at that time. And during our discussions, Fred told me about his 18-year property cycle. He said there would be a boom in the late 1980s, and with a peak around 1990, and it would there would be a slump in 1992. Now, as it happened, my wife's parents' farm was close to the town of Nelson, and a local builder who had made a lot of money during the late 1980s wanted to buy one of the fields, which my wife and her brother had inherited from their father. When we knew that that was going to happen, this gave us a chance to try to farm in a more sensible way by obtaining land that was all in one place, rather than spending 2 days a week looking around livestock on 5 different holdings. We were ready to try to buy a farm using the money that my wife's and her brother had obtained for selling this field. Now, so that led us to a search for farming. Nobody in the family wanted to move south, so we looked north. And eventually someone gave us a copy of The Scottish Farmer, which contained an advertisement for this farm that we live on now. My wife was rather frustrated at looking at farms between Yorkshire and the Scottish border. She was looking at the domestic arrangements. Our children were all, 3 of our children were at school, and our eldest son had just left, and he was working on a neighbouring farm near Ilkley. So I took the decision to come up to Scotland on my own to have a look. And having walked round the farm, I said, yes, it's rather bigger than we could afford right away. We didn't have enough cash to buy it outright. But I said, if we could buy it at the right price, we should have a go. The rest of my family came to have a look, and they agreed that we should do that. So we made arrangements to sell the property, the land that we bought near Ilkley, other property that we had acquired between 1974 and 1990. And so we're following Fred's advice, knowing that we were probably selling at the top of the market. And by 1992, we were ready to buy at the bottom of the market, which enabled us to buy 650 acres, which is the home farm here. for a price which was related very closely to its productive capacity. I was given the rule of thumb that farmland should be worth 20 times its annual rental value. And that was approximated to the amount that we bid, but the farm has 6 cottages on it, so we paid rather more than the £1,000 an acre, and our bid was accepted. We moved here in October 1992, and we brought some livestock with us from Yorkshire. We had enough. We borrowed money from the bank to buy the livestock for the farm, and gradually we've paid off the mortgage that we got to supplement what we had at the start when we left Yorkshire to buy the farm and to stock it with livestock and get the appropriate machinery. So that's how we came to be buying and farming this 650 acres. The additional land that is referred to is land that belongs to neighbours. Our nearest neighbour, he retired, wanted to give up farming himself, and so we took over looking after that land. It's about another 230 acres. And more land immediately adjoining our farm came available. So we've taken all on short-term tenancies. There are still gentlemen around. And so all the land that we've farming now is based on a gentleman's agreement that if whoever wanted the land back, they could have it if they gave us a year or two's notice. And if we wanted to quit the land, then we would give them a similar notice back. And so we're in a position now that we have no bank borrowings. We have, apart from the seasonal rents that we pay, we don't have any rent to pay. So we're able to make a reasonable living without relying on farm subsidies. We made a decision when in the early 2000s, when the common market and subsidy system was being revised, and there was talk of phasing out subsidies by 2013. We decided to structure what we were doing to make sure that we could farm profitably without subsidies by 2013, which we did. So we have 2 sons farming here in Scotland. My eldest son has taken over the management and most of the work on the home farm here. My younger son is farming near Newborough in Fife. He's renting most of the land that he's farming. He has a small stake in land that's close to where the farm buildings are and where he lives. But he was asked 2 years ago to take on another about 350 acres of hill land. And he has the advantage of dealing directly with the owner of that land, rather than going through a land agent. The owner wants to see the land well managed and farmed. He likes shooting and fishing, and when he brings his guests to the farm, he wants it to be looking well. And so he's prepared. He isn't looking for the last pound in rent. He wants to have his land well looked after. So the arrangement suits very well for my son. My wife and I farm in partnership with my younger son and his wife on that holding, also with our elder son and his wife on this one, so that we can use machinery and facilities that are appropriate for use. For instance, my younger son has the combine harvester. He owns that. My elder son owns the forage harvester for making grass silage, and so on. So that's the sort of when there's need for extra labour on either one farm or another, whether it's for shearing sheep or handling cattle, then we're available to do it. So that's where we are now. And we've certainly no regrets about making the move to Scotland.
Where we are right now, then, Duncan, is that you've been running a farm certainly since I mean, I think you were born on a farm, weren't you? And then so you had your time in Yorkshire, and also what is an amazing example of how you timed your sale and purchase of land around Fred Harrison's 18-year cycle,
Yes,
which was extraordinarily foresighted. And I know I mean, I'd like to get into the work you did in Rent Unmasked now. Is that you start off with the principles of the Scottish Enlightenment, and particularly Adam Smith, William Ogilvy, and Robbie Burns.
yes,
Just wondered if you could share with us just a few of the key principles of their work, which I know I mean, you could talk for hours on that. So just briefly for our listeners, of why their ideas are still relevant today, especially in regards to the land question.
yes. Well, beginning with Adam Smith. See, I'd always been curious when I was at school why neighbouring farmers, some of them seem to be very prosperous, they could get a new machinery and whatever, and others with similar areas of land seem to be struggling. And that's when it revealed to me that the difference between owning the land without paying rent or paying rent, and say if you had 100-acre farm, and there were quite a few in the area around Ilkley, there could be £100 an acre for the rent. Well, on 100 acres, that's £10,000. And if one farmer was paying £10,000 rent every year, he had £10,000 to find before he made himself a living. Whereas the neighbour who'd inherited the farm from his father had no rent to pay. So the tenant was always struggling with debt. He had to borrow money, whereas the owner occupier. So the difference in land tenure before I ever knew anything at all about Fred Harrison and the land price cycle, or even Adam Smith. But what really brought it to me more clearly was that when I was at Leeds University, one of the staff in our department was from Denmark. And he mentioned the name Henry George. And I'd never heard of Henry George. And he thought, oh, yes, a wonderful man, Henry George. And I thought, well, I didn't believe him. I thought, being a highly educated 30-year-old university lecturer, if I hadn't heard of Henry George, he probably wasn't worth knowing. But he persuaded me to borrow his book. And having read it, I thought, this is too good to be true. But that led me to get to know Fred Harrison. And then when I'd met him, I looked further into the land question and found out about Adam Smith and his analysis of how wealth is created by labour, using land and other natural resources to create wealth. This was what he clearly defined in his book, The Wealth of Nations. And I was convinced, and I say knowing Fred Harrison, that this analysis was valid, and that land, as Adam Smith stated, is not capital. It can't. It is a separate and distinct factor in the creation of wealth, and it differs from capital in the fact that you can't make more land whereas you can make more capital. And capital, he declared, was wealth which was invested to create more wealth. So money on its own isn't capital, because money can't do anything on its own. Money can be spent on buying capital, and capital, in my case, is the farm machinery and the livestock, and they are the working capital of the farm. So it's not true to, as most academic economists claim, that land is just another form of capital. Now, having got that and met Fred Harrison, then I was introduced to William Ogilvy, who was a contemporary of Adam Smith's. And he was the professor of philosophy, I think was the title, at Aberdeen University, and he was the friend of Robert Burns. And he wrote a book called Birthright in Land. He published the book anonymously because such was the pressure by the landowning people in Scotland that he felt that his life was threatened if he had declared who had written the book. But he, as I say, was a friend of Robert Burns. And so when Robert Burns speaks about the plight of poor people and wanting to highlight the difficulty of tenant farmers, particularly in Scotland. His father was a tenant farmer, and he's quite a few of his poems, although he's very famous for his poems about his relationship with the lassies. He was very concerned about poor and disadvantaged people everywhere. And he agreed with Ogilvy that the land was, and how it was, what the tenure of the land was of great importance.
And I know in your book, in the chapter in Rent Unmasked, you talk about economic freedom can't exist without land reform.
Yes, without economic, political freedom, yes. That's, I think, John Stuart Mill who declared that.
Yes.
And the fund, because land is essential for everybody, I remember trying to engage the Department of Economics at Leeds University in discussions about land and land tenure. Eventually, I found somebody who was prepared to listen to me, and he said that land wasn't important. And so I said, where could you go without it? And after a few minutes, or half a minute or so, looking down, and he had to smile and agree that he couldn't go anywhere without the land. And so, but he still wasn't prepared to accept that land was a separate and distinct factor in the creation of wealth.
No, I mean, it's absolutely, it brings us back to Mason Gaffney's work, doesn't it? Especially with the corruption of economics, and it is absolutely remarkable, and the utter waste of time it is trying to engage an economist into a conversation about land. Is that, I mean, I can only conclude from my side is that the brainwashing or the distortion in the basically the field of insight has been so great that they just can't even contemplate it. It's amazing.
Yes, it is. And also, most of economics, academic economics courses is really advanced applied mathematics.
Yes. Yeah.
When it comes to drawing up their equations, trying to forecast economic performance, they prefer just to have two factors, labour and capital.
Yes.
And that's why they've put capital and land together so that it makes calculation much more manageable. And so they have an instant dislike of a three-factor economic equation model. They prefer it simply to be two factors.
Yeah.
And I think that this makes most of their forecasts. I don't think they've ever, in predicting GDP, for instance, that they've ever forecast accurately.
No. No. And I mean, it's one of those things, isn't it, where it seems like a theoretical problem, but it's got absolutely fundamental impact on stuff. And I'm just wondering if you can just share with the listeners your experience of the main problems with the way that farmland's valued and used today, and how this has a knock-on effect, especially for people who want to be farmers and with rural communities.
Yes, well, I think, as I said, I'd written to Geoffrey Howe.
And he was just for our international listeners, he was a Chancellor of the Exchequer,
Yeah,
or in American terms, a Treasury Secretary
yes,
in Margaret Thatcher's first government.
that's right. And I read a report that he was planning to give farmers who sold their land for development freedom from capital gains tax, which had been introduced earlier, if they reinvested that money in more land within 3 years. And I wrote to Geoffrey Howe and told him that I thought that that would increase the price of land and attract speculators into the market for land, seeking a rise, taking advantage of the rise in land prices to make money. And I got a letter from someone in the first private secretary, he said he was, in the Treasury, who said that my points would be noted, but the Chancellor went ahead anyway. So from that date, when people sold land for development at a price which was probably between 10 and 20 times its use for agricultural purposes, they could buy a bigger piece of land with the money that they got. And also, they could buy the land and avoid paying the tax. And then that was the first stimulus to the increase in land prices. Also, in the 1970s, we joined the common market.
So I just want to point this out to listeners here, because there's currently controversy in Britain about the Labour government changing the inheritance tax rules. And the criticism has come into them, and they claim that they are going after the people who use inheritance tax rules on land to avoid paying tax. But because their legislation is so badly designed, they're hitting farmers and not really hitting the investors, who are often protected by financial trusts and other things anyway. That's right, isn't it?
That's right.
And
But
yet, and to tell you, just to point out that this problem was caused by badly designed tax laws
yes,
45 years ago.
that was the
So
start.
instead of sorting out the bad tax law from 45 years ago, the government are trying to bodge a repair to the tax law, and in doing so, they're harming farmers even more.
Yes, yes, I call it a peevish or spiteful tax, trying to stop those people. But even there, if they look more closely at the economic setup, most of the money which is spent on farmland now, I spoke to Savills not long ago, and still about half the farmland that comes up for sale is bought by other farmers. And then there are the people who have made a lot of money, mostly in the financial sector, bankers, investment banks in the square mile in London with huge bonuses. They are buying land. And then there are those who are seeking to buy land to offset their carbon emissions. Commercial companies who are wanting to get carbon credits for that. but still it's being bought by farmers. And so there are farmers like us who aren't relying on subsidy payments, still getting subsidy payments that they don't need. And the most attractive place to invest it is in more land. So there are farmers who are expanding, but the problem with that is that the biggest complaint that I get from my neighbours around here from my neighbours around here is the difficulty in finding staff. I can count about 12 farms that have disappeared, being bought by neighbouring farmers in the time that over the last 15 or 20 years. And those farms, there's one in particular, which I think I refer to in the chapter on rent, that the size of the farm, every farmers claim that large farms are more efficient. And I mentioned a neighbouring farm, it was 180 acres or thereabouts in the village, and it was sold about 10 years ago and bought by a neighbouring farmer, part of in the area. It's still 4 or 5 miles from his home farm, but he bought it. And in discussions with other farmers at the market one day, they said, oh, well, 185 acres wasn't sufficient for anybody to make a living. It had to be taken on by a bigger holding to make it viable. And I said, well, the chap who had farmed it previously, who'd inherited it from his father, seemed to be farming and making a living quite well. He could buy new equipment. He certainly wasn't in any debt. So it was a viable unit. I said, but it's not a viable unit now. And they looked at me as though I had said something absolutely stupid. I said, it's not viable because its selling price was 1.2 million. It's the price of the land that made it not viable, not the fact that it wasn't capable of making a living. And a lot of farmers try to claim that large farms are more efficient than small ones. But economies of scale are very difficult to find in farming. When you look closely at the figures, large farms are claimed to be more efficient. Well, the only measure of efficiency which reliably increases with increasing farm size is output per person employed. If you measure output per unit of energy expended or output per unit area, they seldom increase in line with farm size. It's a false claim to make. The problem is the high price of land, which, as I claim, is caused by government failure in the tax system, which favours investment in landed property, and it tries to, because it doesn't collect the annual ground rent, which Adam Smith said was the most suitable source of revenue for funding the necessary functions of government. They are taxing employment and trade. The biggest two are income taxes. This includes national insurance charge, which is really another form of income tax, and value-added tax, VAT, which both strongly inhibit both employment and trade. And so for the government to be claiming to be looking for growth by increasing the taxes on labour, they're never going to achieve any meaningful measure of growth. And I'd also like at this point to say that the measure that everybody uses for growth is GDP, gross domestic product. Well, it's a very poor indicator of economic prosperity. A lot of what's included in GDP, nothing is produced. Money that's spent on high land prices doesn't produce more land. There's no more land produced. And so, and recover from natural disasters, which are expensive to recover from. That again doesn't, at the end, need to do any more improvement in the nation's finances, and also money which is wasted on projects. I suppose you could include HS2 as one of those. But a more obvious one was the aim of the Blair government to computerize all the medical records on a single computer system, so that people could, if somebody moved from Manchester to Exeter, then and had an accident, then the medical records would be available. But that completely failed, and it cost 10 billion. Now, one of the major components of GDP is government spending. That was government spending, and so and then it was wasted. So GDP is a poor indicator.
Yes. And so, and in your book, and also in Rent Unmasked, you recommend the introduction of an annual ground rent.
Yes.
I just wonder if you can, especially for our listeners in America, how does an annual ground rent differ from traditional property taxes, and what benefits would it bring to farming and to society as a whole?
Well, an annual ground rent is what it says. The annual rental value of land is collected by the government to fund its necessary functions, but it is the unimproved value of the land itself. It isn't like the normal property taxes in many countries, which includes the value of improvements on that land, like houses and buildings. Experiments have been done, trials in America, particularly in Pennsylvania, where a split tax system is used, and the rental value of the land is a bigger proportion of the tax collected than the value of the buildings. And where that has been implemented, it shows that economic activity greatly improves. So if you're having the rating system, which includes the value of a house, if someone improves their house, they pay more tax, which inhibits improvements and developments. And whereas prior to 1970, the average proportion of a house price, which was the land on which it stands, was between 10 and 15%. Now it's more than 50%. And in the southeast of England, it even goes up to 80 or even 90% of the value of the property is the increase in the price of the land. And this is completely ignored by the Inland Revenue. They don't keep any records of changes in land price, so they've no idea what influence it has. And as an example of the systemic failure of the existing system, I've got the figures for Japan. For the number of registered accountants, Japan has 33.2 thousand registered accountants for a population of 125 million and an economy much bigger than ours. We have 357,000 accountants for a population of 60 million. Now, isn't there something fundamentally systematically wrong with a tax system which requires all that? I'm not saying all those accountants are employed by the Inland Revenue. Most of them are employed by people like me who have to employ it because the tax system is so difficult to understand, virtually impossible to know whether you're paying the right amounts. And
Amazing.
those two figures should be in front of everybody's mind, especially the Chancellor of the Exchequer, when they're pretending to produce a budget that's going to promote economic growth.
So we've got an economy that's approximately twice the size of ours in people and in output, and we have 10 times as many
Yeah.
accountants as they do,
Yes.
which gives you it's a de facto measure of complexity in tax rules
Yes.
and
Now, now
understanding that what obligations you have to the government because because the tax laws are so complicated.
that's all right. But the other thing is that to do implement the collection of an annual ground rent, we can map the whole country with by computerized mapping. You can't move the land. We know where it is, and it's very easy to value.
Yes.
The value, a friend of mine, Mark Wadsworth, the late Mark Wadsworth, he did a land value estimation for his hometown, Swindon, based on the postcode. And the land within a particular postcode could be different depending on how near it is to schools and railway stations and all the things that affect land price. And he came up with a realistic differential without anybody having to wander around streets valuing houses and what their contents are and whether they've got double glazing and all the other things. And so we're stuck with a council tax system based on 1991 values. Nobody has attempted to have a revaluation, certainly not in the last 20 years, because and it would be impossible to do. There aren't enough valuers in the country to do it.
Mm.
Don't mind the expense of doing it. Whereas if all you had to do was value the land on which houses stand, and all our farmland is all mapped. And again, that varies in value whereabouts it is in the country. And there are areas, certainly in Scotland, where the annual rental value is very low. So there would be very little tax to pay in those areas. The better land, which we are farming, would attract a higher annual rental charge. But we would be able to pay it. The difference between that and income tax, if we take on another employee, we have to start sending roughly a third of his gross salary in NIC and income tax to the Inland Revenue every month. And so the gross cost of employment for every 2 employees, we've got to send the take-home pay for another one to the Inland Revenue. If we were basing it on the rental value of the land, I would far rather prefer to pay 2 checks a year, say, and thinking of the rental value as just a figure which might need to be varied a little bit, approximately 60 or 70,000 pounds a year. I would prefer to pay as an annual ground rent to the government without having to keep all the records that I've got for even though food production and agriculture is most of it is 0 rated, we still got to justify all that. So it's another big weight of bureaucracy that we have to cope with, even though the agriculture is largely 0 rated. So it would be much simpler for us to do that. And I think that we would be financially better off. We could spend more time farming instead of keeping accounts.
And so given the attractiveness of having an annual ground rent, what are the biggest challenges or criticisms you face when you're advocating for a change in traditional taxation? and the
Well,
introduction of AGR?
the financial sector is the biggest burden against it because it's estimated that 97% of the money which flows through the financial sector is debt on domestic mortgages. And so they wouldn't like to see the price of houses come down because they rely on that for their income. House owners, you see, when we almost had an annual ground rent introduced in 1910, and the House of Lords vetoed it because most of the landowners in the House of Lords had the power of veto at that time, and that they thought they were going to be worse off. Now we've got millions of people who are landowners, although they wouldn't classify themselves as landowners, but they own the land on which their houses sit. And if their houses are worth 500,000, then the value of the land underneath is at least half that. And if the price of land fell because we were collecting an annual ground rent, there would be less money needed to be borrowed to produce houses. And so those who have a vested interest in the present system, where they can effectively collect the annual ground rent, they call it interest on mortgages, but it's really ground rent, most of it.
Mm.
And they have the ear of the government and financial influence on the government. They supply accountants free of charge to the Treasury. They're very reluctant to change the system, which they are making a lot of profit from acquiring. And this is where the big bonuses are being paid to the senior members of the financial sector, who are paying high prices for agricultural land, which the Chancellor was aiming to get in her last budget, and she's instead upset a hell of a lot of farmers.
Yes.
She's going to leave these people with their cash and make it more difficult for farmers to pass on to the next generation.
Yeah. And in many respects, it's gonna make more land available to speculators and people looking for the tax breaks who can still get the tax breaks because it could be that the land then gets owned by a trust out of Jersey
That's
or
right.
the Isle of Man.
Anywhere.
And then there's no tax coming in. So I know we're running out of time, Duncan. Is there anything you want to just to wrap up the conversation, just to say to our listeners about these topics that you've devoted so much of your life to promoting?
I think that if we could appreciate the fact that land is such a large, but most of the wealth of the total value of this country is the land in the country. And it gets very, very little attention by economists.
Well, Duncan, I just want to tell people that this is your original book, I'll Lie of the Land, a study in the culture of deception. And as I was saying, you contributed to the book Rent Unmasked, which we're re-releasing as an ebook. And we're currently working on an ebook version of Lie of the Land as well. So, Duncan, we really appreciate your time and your commitment to making a positive difference.
Well, thank you, John. I hope that you can make something of that when you've gone through it all.
Yes, definitely
If
can.
there's anything you want me to clarify or anything,
That's brilliant.
I'll be very pleased to do so.
To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit Shepheard-Walwyn.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers, and also to buy the books. So until next time, keep reading.